March 7th, 1945. Hill 362, Iwo Jima. Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura pressed his eye against the observation slit, watching American Marines gather in the volcanic valley below. For 3 days, his commander had positioned 817 men across this strategic plateau, transforming it into what Japanese intelligence called an impenetrable fortress. The Marines were walking into a killing zone so perfectly designed that Nakamura allowed himself something he had not felt since Saipan hope. Within 6 hours, that hope would become the worst miscalculation of his military career, and 500 Japanese soldiers would die in an assault so violent it would redefine what Imperial Army veterans believed about Marine capabilities. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hill 362 rose 160 feet above the surrounding terrain on Iwo Jima's central plateau. Japanese engineers had spent 4 months fortifying this position under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's direct supervision. The general understood terrain better than any defensive commander Japan had fielded in the Pacific War. He recognized that Hill 362 offered something rare in modern combat, a position where geography could neutralize American firepower advantages. The hill's northern face descended in gradual slopes that artillery could pound endlessly without reaching the reverse slope fortifications. The southern approach rose steeply through broken ground, where tanks could not operate, and infantry would struggle under the weight of combat equipment. The eastern flank butted against a lava ridge, honeycombed with caves that provided protected observation over the entire valley. The western side dropped into a ravine, so choked with volcanic rock that movement required climbing rather than walking. Kuribayashi had examined this ground personally in January and declared it perfect for the defensive strategy he envisioned. He was not wrong about the terrain. He was catastrophically wrong about what Marines would do when they encountered it. The fortification plan reflected everything Japanese defenders had learned fighting Marines across the Pacific. No banzai charges that would waste infantry against American automatic weapons, no exposed positions that naval gunfire could obliterate, no predictable defensive lines that Marine combined arms tactics could systematically reduce. Instead, Kuribayashi ordered construction of a defensive network that would force Marines into close combat, where American material advantages meant less and Japanese fighting spirit could prove decisive. Engineers carved 47 interconnected bunkers into Hill 362's reverse slopes and ridgelines. Each position was reinforced with coconut logs, steel rails salvaged from the island's sugar mill, and volcanic rock that absorbed artillery impacts without collapsing. Firing ports were designed to provide interlocking fields of fire while remaining invisible from more than 50 yards distance. Tunnels connected every major position, allowing defenders to shift between bunkers as Marines advanced, creating the illusion that destroyed positions were somehow reoccupying themselves. Ammunition stores were distributed throughout the network so that cutting off one section would not disarm the others. Medical stations, command posts, and supply dumps were located in the deepest caves where naval bombardment could not reach them. The entire complex could house 800 men indefinitely, with water stored in drums and rice stockpiled for months of siege warfare. Lieutenant Nakamura had arrived at Hill 362 on February 23rd, 4 days after the Marine landing, with 140 men from the 309th Independent Infantry Battalion. His orders were explicit and reflected Kuribayashi's understanding that Iwo Jima could not be held, only defended long enough to bleed the Marine divisions so severely that American public opinion would force negotiation rather than invasion of Japan's home islands. Hold Hill 362 for 2 weeks minimum. Inflict maximum casualties through coordinated fire from concealed positions. Preserve your force by avoiding direct confrontation until Marines close to hand grenade range. When the position becomes untenable, fall back through the tunnel network to secondary positions. Every day you hold delays the American advance. Every Marine you kill is one less enemy in the final battle. Nakamura read these orders in his bunker on the reverse slope and felt the weight of impossible mathematics. 2 weeks against the force he had watched land on February 19th. 2 weeks against men who had taken Tarawa in 76 hours, despite casualties that would have broken any rational military unit. 2 weeks against Marines. The first 3 days established patterns that gave Nakamura cautious optimism. Marines probed Hill 362's approaches, with company-sized advances supported by Sherman tanks and intensive artillery preparation. Japanese observers let them advance to within 200 yards, then unleashed coordinated fire from bunkers the Marines had not spotted. Mortars registered on pre-planned coordinates dropped rounds among advancing infantry. Machine guns firing from reverse slope positions caught Marines in enfilade fire they could not identify or suppress. Anti-tank guns positioned in cave mouths disabled Shermans at ranges where American tankers could not locate the firing positions. The Marines would take casualties, pull back, call in artillery that pounded empty ground, then try again with identical results. By the evening of March 6th, Nakamura calculated that his positions had killed or wounded approximately 90 Marines while suffering, only 14 casualties among his own men. The ratio suggested that properly prepared defensive positions could neutralize American firepower advantages. The mathematics seemed to validate Kuribayashi's defensive doctrine. Nakamura wrote in his diary that night that perhaps Hill 362 would hold for the required 2 weeks. Perhaps his men would survive to fall back to secondary positions. Perhaps the sacrifice of Iwo Jima's defenders would buy time for the homeland. Perhaps he had forgotten everything that veterans from Guadalcanal through Peleliu had tried to teach him about what happened when Marines decided a position had to fall. March 7th began with naval bombardment heavier than anything Nakamura had experienced in the previous 16 days. Destroyers positioned offshore fired salvo after salvo into Hill 362's northern slopes. The shells created geysers of black volcanic sand and rock but caused minimal damage to reverse slope fortifications. Nakamura watched through his observation slit as the barrage walked across terrain his men did not occupy, wasting thousands of rounds on empty ground. American artillery joined the bombardment at 0700 hours, firing from positions 3,000 yards south. Again, the shells impacted forward slopes and ridgelines, while Japanese defenders waited in protected bunkers carved into the reverse side. At 0745, carrier aircraft appeared overhead and bombed the hill with high explosives and napalm that created spectacular fireballs but failed to penetrate underground positions. Nakamura allowed himself to believe the Americans were wasting ammunition in frustration. He did not yet understand that this bombardment was different from previous days. The Marines were not probing. They were preparing to take Hill 362 regardless of cost, and the bombardment was designed not to destroy Japanese positions but to mark them for the assault forces through observer reports, radioed from forward positions. The bombardment ceased at 0830. Nakamura expected the usual company-sized probe that he would repel with coordinated fire from concealed positions. Instead, he watched 2 full Marine battalions form up in the valley below, approximately 1,200 men, arranged in assault waves with tank support and flamethrower teams visible among the infantry. Japanese observers throughout the defensive network reported the formations to Nakamura's command bunker. Every approach to Hill 362 was covered by similar forces. The Americans were committing not a probe but a divisional-level assault with at least 4,000 Marines preparing to advance simultaneously from multiple directions. Nakamura realized with cold clarity that the Americans had stopped testing his defenses and decided to overwhelm them through sheer force, regardless of casualties. He passed orders to all bunker commanders: hold fire until Marines close to 100 yards. Concentrate fire on officers and tank crews. Preserve ammunition for sustained combat. Prepare to fall back through tunnels if positions become untenable. Do not waste lives in suicidal last stands. We are here to kill Marines, not to die gloriously. Kill them efficiently and survive to kill more. The assault began at 0900 hours, with Marine infantry advancing in carefully controlled waves, while Sherman tanks provided mobile fire support. Japanese defenders held their fire as instructed, watching Americans move across open ground that seemed like a shooting gallery from the defensive positions. At 120 yards, Nakamura gave the order to fire. 47 bunkers opened simultaneously with machine guns, rifles, and light mortars. The effect was devastating. The first Marine wave took catastrophic casualties as interlocking fire caught them in a kill zone with no cover. Men fell in clusters as machine gun fire swept through formations. Tank commanders buttoned their hatches as anti-tank rounds disabled 3 Shermans in the first 2 minutes. The advance staggered as sergeants and lieutenants were specifically targeted by Japanese marksmen trained to recognize rank insignia. Nakamura watched Marines go to ground behind whatever minimal cover the volcanic terrain provided: rocks, shell craters, dead ground in slight depressions. The assault appeared to have failed exactly as previous probes had failed. Then something happened that contradicted every assumption about how military forces respond to taking 50% casualties in the first 5 minutes of an attack. The Marines did not retreat. Sergeants reorganized survivors without waiting for orders from above. Squads identified Japanese firing positions through muzzle flashes and began coordinating suppressive fire, while other teams maneuvered toward the bunkers. Tank commanders who had buttoned their hatches now opened them again to acquire targets despite anti-tank fire, calling in positions to supporting artillery. Marine mortarmen set up tubes in the open under fire and began dropping rounds on reverse slope positions they could not see, but had plotted from maps during the bombardment. Within 10 minutes of taking devastating casualties, the Marine assault was not retreating, but accelerating. Units that should have been combat ineffective were instead adapting faster than Japanese commanders could respond. Nakamura watched a Marine rifle squad advance toward a bunker on his left flank. Machine gun fire killed the squad leader and 2 riflemen. The survivors immediately shifted their approach, using dead ground and suppressive fire from other positions. When they reached the bunker, a flamethrower operator was killed before he could fire. His assistant grabbed the weapon and burned out the firing port while demolition engineers placed satchel charges against the entrance. The position fell in less than 4 minutes from first contact. This pattern repeated across the hill as Marines applied systematic violence to every defensive position. The speed of the Marine advance shocked Japanese defenders who had expected Americans to pull back and reorganize after taking such severe casualties. Instead, small unit leaders made independent decisions to keep attacking, exploiting opportunities before Japanese forces could react. Radio communications allowed unprecedented coordination as observers called in supporting fire within seconds of identifying targets. Tanks advanced in support of infantry rather than waiting for orders, with commanders making tactical decisions at company level that Japanese doctrine reserved for battalion commanders. The result was an assault that never lost momentum, despite casualties that would have forced any other military force to halt and regroup. By 1000 hours, Marines had penetrated Hill 362's outer defensive ring at multiple points. Nakamura ordered controlled withdrawal, through tunnel networks to secondary positions as planned. His men executed the retreat professionally, moving through underground passages, while rear guards maintained fire to cover the movement. But when they reached the secondary positions and prepared to resume defensive operations, they discovered Marines had somehow advanced faster through surface terrain than Japanese forces had retreated through protected tunnels. Corporal Hideaki Saito, positioned in a secondary bunker on the eastern ridge, watched in disbelief as Marines appeared on ground that should have been empty for at least another hour. His after-action report, recovered from his body 3 days later, captured the confusion Japanese defenders felt. "We withdrew through tunnels as ordered, expecting to establish new defensive positions before the Americans could advance. When we emerged, Marines were already assaulting bunkers we had abandoned minutes earlier. How did they move so fast through terrain we know better than they do? They carried full equipment loads. They had casualties to evacuate. They were under fire from positions they had not yet located. Yet they advanced continuously without pause. This is not rational military behavior. This is something we were never trained to counter." The answer was that Marine training emphasized aggressive forward movement as the default response to contact. When in doubt, advance. When taking casualties, advance faster to close with the enemy. When encountering resistance, fix it with fire and maneuver around it, rather than stopping to reduce it. This doctrine created assaults that maintained momentum through casualties that would have halted forces trained in more methodical tactics. By 1100 hours, Nakamura recognized that his 2-week defense timeline had collapsed to 2 hours. Marines had penetrated to Hill 362's central positions and were systematically reducing bunkers with combined arms, tactics that Japanese defenders could not counter. Flamethrowers burned out positions that machine gun fire could not suppress. Demolition teams destroyed bunkers that flamethrowers could not reach. Tank fire collapsed cave entrances faster than defenders could respond. Artillery walked across the hill in coordinated patterns that forced Japanese soldiers to choose between staying in bunkers that were being destroyed or moving through open ground where Marine riflemen waited. Every option led to death. The only variable was timing. Nakamura passed final orders to remaining positions. Inflict maximum casualties. Preserve no ammunition for retreat. We die here. Make the Americans pay for this ground. The orders reflected Kuribayashi's ultimate defensive strategy. When positions could not be held, they would become killing grounds, where Japanese defenders traded their lives for Marine casualties at rates that might make future assaults too costly to contemplate. The final phase of Hill 362's defense demonstrated both the courage of Japanese soldiers and the futility of that courage against an enemy with overwhelming material advantages and equal determination. Bunker after bunker fought until Marines destroyed them with explosives or fire. Machine gun crews fired until their weapons melted or they ran out of ammunition, then fought with rifles and grenades. When those were expended, they fought with bayonets and swords. When they could no longer fight, they died. The Americans gave them no choice and asked for none. This was industrial warfare applied without mercy to achieve an objective that higher command had designated as necessary. Individual Japanese courage meant nothing against systematic application of overwhelming force. By 1300 hours, organized resistance on Hill 362 had collapsed. Isolated positions continued fighting, but the defensive network that Nakamura had believed impregnable had been penetrated, fragmented, and destroyed in 4 hours of combat so intense that veterans would describe it as the worst fighting they experienced on Iwo Jima. Lieutenant Nakamura died in his command bunker at approximately 1400 hours when Marine engineers placed 70 pounds of explosives against the entrance and detonated them. The blast collapsed the tunnel system and killed all 17 men inside instantly. His diary, recovered 3 days later, when burial details excavated the position, contained a final entry written at 1200 hours. The Marines have broken through all defensive lines. We have killed hundreds of them. More keep coming. I believed this position could hold for 2 weeks. It held for 4 hours against men who will not stop attacking regardless of casualties. General Kuribayashi was wrong. There is no defense that can survive such an enemy. We can only die and hope our deaths by hours rather than days. This is what the Empire has become. Men dying for hours. The mathematics Nakamura had trusted that properly prepared positions could inflict casualties sufficient to halt Marine advances proved false because it assumed Americans would respond rationally to losses. Marines did not respond rationally. They responded with increased aggression, accepting casualties that seemed suicidal to achieve objectives faster than defenders could adapt. The final casualty count from Hill 362 arrived at 5th Marine Division headquarters on the evening of March 7th. 214 Marines killed, 463 wounded, 817 Japanese defenders dead, 0 prisoners. The arithmetic told a story that contradicted everything American military doctrine suggested about acceptable loss ratios. The Marines had suffered nearly 35% casualties to take a position they could have bypassed, a hill that offered marginal tactical advantage, ground that mattered only because Japanese forces occupied it. Any rational assessment would conclude the attack was a costly mistake. Instead, Marine commanders logged it as a successful assault that achieved objectives within acceptable time parameters. The word acceptable did not mean the same thing to Marines as it meant to other military organizations. It meant the position fell when ordered to fall. The cost was irrelevant to that calculation. Private First Class James Mitchell, who survived the assault with shrapnel wounds across his back and legs, wrote to his family 3 weeks later from a hospital ship. They told us to take the hill and we took it. Half my squad died doing it. The Japanese fought harder than anything we faced on Saipan. They had perfect positions and they knew we were coming. We walked into a meat grinder and kept walking until we came out the other side. People ask if it was worth it. I don't know how to answer that. We were ordered to take the hill. We took it. That's what Marines do. Whether it was worth the cost is a question for someone with higher pay grade than mine. I just know that every man who died on that hill believed we would take it. And we did. Mitchell's letter captured the fundamental difference between Marine culture and conventional military thinking. Objectives were not negotiable. Costs were not calculated before attacks. Orders were executed regardless of circumstances. This mentality created an organization that terrified enemies precisely because it operated according to principles that seemed irrational to anyone not immersed in Marine identity. The speed of the Hill 362 assault shocked Japanese commanders across Iwo Jima who had monitored the battle through radio reports and observer positions. General Kuribayashi had designed defenses based on calculations that proved accurate everywhere except in one critical assumption that Americans would pause after taking severe casualties to reorganize and resupply. The Hill 362 assault demonstrated that Marines did not pause. They absorbed casualties and maintained operational tempo through immediate replacement of fallen leaders, decentralized decision-making that kept units functional despite losses, and a culture that treated high casualty rates as expected rather than exceptional. Colonel Takeshi Nishi, commander of the tank regiment defending Iwo Jima's northern sector, wrote in his diary on March 8th after receiving reports from Hill 362. We killed 200 Marines and wounded 400 more in 4 hours of fighting. This should have halted their advance for days while they reorganized and replaced casualties. Instead, they took the hill and continued attacking adjacent positions the same afternoon. This is militarily impossible. I am beginning to understand why every Japanese officer who has fought the Marines describes them as an enemy unlike any other. They operate according to rules that make victory impossible for defenders with finite resources. The truth Nishi recognized was that Marine divisions functioned as regenerating organisms rather than fixed military units. Casualties were factored into operational planning from the beginning. Every rifle company landed with the expectation of 50 to 75% losses over the course of a campaign. Replacement drafts arrived continuously from training depots in the United States, maintaining unit strength even as veteran Marines fell. The system meant that Marine divisions could sustain combat operations at intensities that would have destroyed other military organizations. 5th Marine Division on Iwo Jima suffered over 6,000 casualties in the campaign's first 2 weeks, nearly 40% of its infantry strength. Rather than withdrawing to rebuild, the division continued offensive operations while absorbing replacements who arrived on landing ships and were fed directly into combat units. Private Thomas Henderson, one of these replacements, landed on Iwo Jima on March 10th and found himself in a frontline fighting position within 6 hours. His first letter home described the experience with bewilderment. "I trained for 8 months to become a Marine. I landed on Iwo Jima in the morning, and by afternoon I was in a shell hole fighting Japanese soldiers I couldn't see. The corporal who commanded my squad had been on the island for 3 weeks. He looked like he had aged 10 years. He told me to do what he said, and I might survive. 3 men in our squad had died that morning. I was replacing one of them. Nobody acted like this was unusual. This is just how it works here. You land, you fight, you survive, or you don't. Then someone else lands and takes your place. It never stops." The replacement system that enabled continuous Marine operations was incomprehensible to Japanese military planners who operated with fixed unit strengths and no effective replacement pipeline. Every Japanese casualty was permanent. Every position lost could not be reinforced. Every defender killed represented irreplaceable combat power. The mathematics favored Americans, even when Marines suffered higher casualties because American casualties were temporary, while Japanese losses were final. Major Yoshitaka Hori, senior staff officer at General Kuribayashi's headquarters, calculated these numbers in mid-March and recognized the implications. "We have killed approximately 8,000 Marines since the landing on February 19th. This is more than 1/10 of their assault force. In any previous war, such casualties would force the attacking army to halt and rebuild. The Americans landed replacement Marines faster than we killed veterans. Their combat power increases daily while ours diminishes. We are not fighting a military campaign. We are fighting American industrial capacity. Each Japanese soldier who dies is gone forever. Each Marine who falls is replaced by another Marine within days. We cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy with infinite replacements. All we can do is die and hope the political cost of our deaths exceeds the strategic value of our islands." The political calculation Hori referenced was Kuribayashi's strategic framework for defending Iwo Jima. The island could not be held indefinitely. Japanese forces could only make its capture so expensive that American public opinion would force negotiation rather than invasion of the home islands. Hill 362 was supposed to contribute to this strategy by delaying Marine advances for weeks while inflicting thousands of casualties. Instead, it fell in 4 hours with casualties the Marines absorbed without operational pause. The failure revealed the fundamental flaw in Japanese strategic thinking. Americans in 1945 possessed both the material capacity to replace casualties and the national will to accept them. Japan had neither. The war had become a mathematical problem with only one solution. Yet, Japanese forces continued fighting with desperate courage because surrender contradicted everything their culture taught about honorable conduct. This created combat of extraordinary brutality, where Japanese soldiers died defending positions they knew were doomed, while Marines killed them to take ground that mattered only because orders designated it as objectives. Sergeant Robert Dawson, who fought across Hill 362 with his rifle squad, tried to explain the experience to a journalist who visited his unit 3 days after the battle. "You want to know what it was like? It was like fighting ghosts who wanted to die, but wanted to take you with them." The Japanese didn't defend that hill because they thought they could hold it. They defended it because dying in place was what their orders required. We knew they were going to fight to the death. They knew we were going to take the hill no matter how many of us died doing it. So we just collided in the middle and killed each other until one side was gone. That's modern warfare. It's not about tactics or strategy anymore. It's about who can afford to lose more men fighting over ground that matters only because both sides decide it matters. We could afford the losses. But winning doesn't feel like winning when you're burying your friends afterward. Dawson's assessment captured what many Marines felt about Iwo Jima, that victory measured purely in objectives, achieved ignored the human cost of achieving them. The human cost extended beyond casualties to psychological trauma that would mark survivors for life. Corporal William Hayes, who participated in the Hill 362 assault, was evacuated on March 15th with what military psychiatrists classified as combat exhaustion. His medical records included interviews conducted aboard the hospital ship where he described what happened when his unit cleared bunkers on the hill's reverse slope. "We would burn them out with flamethrowers, or blow the entrances with explosives. Then we would go inside to make sure no one survived. You found men burned so badly they didn't look human anymore. You found men blown apart by explosives. You found men who had fought until they literally couldn't hold weapons. It wasn't combat, it was extermination. We exterminated them because they wouldn't surrender, and orders said we had to take the hill. They died because their culture said surrendering was dishonorable. So we killed them, and they killed us, and when it was over we had the hill, and they were dead, and everyone acted like this was normal. Like this is just what war is. Maybe it is, but it shouldn't be." Hayes never returned to combat duty. His war ended on Hill 362, even though he survived physically intact. The psychological casualties Marines suffered on Iwo Jima exceeded anything seen in previous Pacific campaigns because the fighting never paused long enough for men to process what they experienced. Combat, intensities that should have been temporary spikes, became sustained realities that lasted weeks. Psychiatrists attached to Marine divisions reported treating hundreds of cases where apparently healthy men simply stopped functioning, sitting in foxholes, unresponsive to orders, walking away from positions during combat, breaking down in tears without apparent cause. The official medical term was combat fatigue, but it described something more fundamental than exhaustion. It described men who had absorbed more violence than human minds were designed to process. Many would recover with rest, others would carry the trauma for decades. Private Mitchell, recovering from his physical wounds aboard a hospital ship, witnessed both types. "The man in the bunk next to me hasn't spoken in 3 days. He just stares at the ceiling. The corpsman says he was carrying a wounded Marine when a shell landed nearby. The Marine he was carrying died in his arms." The man broke then, just stopped being whoever he was before, and became this silent thing that doesn't react to anything. "I've got shrapnel in my back and legs. He doesn't have a scratch on him, but I'm going to recover, and he might not." That's what war does. It breaks some men on the outside where you can see the wounds. It breaks others on the inside where nobody knows until it's too late to help them. The Japanese defenders of Hill 362 left no similar records because none survived to receive psychiatric care or describe their experiences. The few diaries recovered from bodies revealed men who understood they were dying for strategic objectives already lost, but who continued fighting because their culture provided no acceptable alternative. Second Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada commanded a machine gun platoon that defended the eastern approaches until his position was destroyed by tank fire on March 7th afternoon. His diary, found in the rubble of his bunker, contained entries that tracked his mental deterioration over 3 weeks of continuous combat. February 24th. We have prepared excellent defensive positions. The Americans will pay dearly for this ground. March 1st. The Marines attack continuously. We inflict casualties, but they keep coming. March 4th. Half my men are dead. Supplies are running low. No reinforcements are coming. March 7th. 900 hours. The Americans are preparing a major assault. I do not believe we will survive the day, but we will make them remember Hill 362. Final entry, 1100 hours. They have broken through. I can hear fighting in the tunnels behind my position. This is the end. I hope my family remembers me with honor. I hope Japan survives what is coming. I know we will not. Yamada's position fell approximately 1 hour after his final entry. Marines found 23 bodies in and around the bunker, all killed by explosives or fire. The strategic impact of Hill 362's fall extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese commanders across Iwo Jima understood that if such a carefully prepared position could fall in 4 hours, no defense could hold Marines for the weeks Kuribayashi's strategy required. The psychological effect on Japanese morale was devastating because it confirmed what veterans had been saying since Guadalcanal, that Marines could not be stopped, only delayed at costs Japan could no longer afford. Captain Tsunezo Wachi, who commanded artillery positions supporting Hill 362's defense, wrote in his diary on March 8th that the battle had destroyed his faith in Japanese military leadership. We were promised that properly prepared defenses could bleed the Americans so severely they would negotiate rather than continue fighting. Hill 362 was perfectly prepared. We had excellent positions, motivated troops, adequate supplies, and terrain that favored defense. The Marines took it in half a day and suffered casualties they replaced within 48 hours. Every assumption our generals made about American vulnerability was wrong. We are not fighting an enemy we can defeat through superior spirit or tactical excellence. We are fighting an industrial giant that can absorb any casualties we inflict and replace them faster than we can kill them. This war should have ended months ago. Every Japanese soldier who dies now dies for nothing except the vanity of leaders who cannot admit they lost. Wachi's assessment reflected growing recognition among Japanese frontline officers that continuing the war served no purpose except avoiding the dishonor of surrender. This created impossible moral dilemmas for men who had been taught that death was preferable to capitulation, but who now understood that their deaths would not change strategic outcomes. Some chose to fight with desperate intensity, seeking meaningful sacrifice in hopeless situations. Others withdrew into fatalism, performing their duties mechanically, while waiting for death they no longer believed served any purpose. Private Kiyoshi Endo, captured on March 24th after being knocked unconscious by a shell blast, described this mentality during interrogation. By mid-March, everyone knew the island was lost. We knew the war was lost. We knew we were going to die for objectives that no longer existed, but we also knew that surrendering was dishonorable and would bring shame to our families. So we kept fighting because dying in combat was the only honorable option left, not because we believed in victory, not because we thought our sacrifice mattered strategically, just because our culture left us no alternative except death. That is what Japanese military tradition did to us. It gave us one choice and called it honor. The Marines gave us the death we chose. I survived only because unconsciousness made the choice for me. The casualty statistics from Iwo Jima's entire campaign reflected the same dynamics visible in microcosm at Hill 362. Marines suffered 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. Japanese forces lost 21,000 killed and 1,000 captured, mostly men too wounded to resist. The exchange ratio favored Japanese defenders in raw numbers, but strategically, the battle represented total American victory because Marines achieved every objective, while Japanese forces achieved none. The island fell on March 26 when organized resistance collapsed. Iwo Jima's airfields, the strategic objective that justified the invasion, became operational within weeks and provided emergency landing sites for B-29 bombers damaged during raids on Japan. More than 2,000 American airmen survived forced landings on Iwo Jima who would have died without those airfields. The campaign's cost was terrible. Its strategic value was quantifiable. The mathematics ultimately favored Americans, not because they suffered fewer casualties, but because American casualties brought tangible results, while Japanese casualties brought only time measured in days rather than weeks. General Kuribayashi died sometime in late March during a final counterattack that accomplished nothing except providing honorable deaths for survivors who could not accept surrender. His body was never identified. His strategic assessment of Marine capabilities proved more accurate than his predictions about how long defenses could delay them. In messages to Tokyo before communications were severed, he acknowledged that Marines represented the most effective fighting force Japan had encountered, that their combination of training, equipment, and cultural willingness to accept casualties made them nearly unstoppable, and that Japan's only hope was that casualty rates on Iwo Jima would deter Americans from invading the home islands. That hope died with the atomic bombings in August. Japan surrendered without the invasion Kuribayashi's defense was meant to prevent. Every Japanese soldier who died on Iwo Jima died for a strategy that failed to achieve its objective. The courage they displayed could not overcome the industrial and military advantages Americans possessed. Individual Japanese soldiers fought as bravely as any warriors in history. Collectively, they could not defeat an enemy who matched their determination while vastly exceeding their resources. The Marines who took Hill 362 and hundreds of similar positions across the Pacific never doubted they would win. They doubted whether they would survive personally, whether their friends would live through the next assault, whether the cost was justified by the objectives. But they never doubted that Marines would take every position they were ordered to take. That certainty, backed by material advantages and systematic training, created a military force that terrified enemies precisely because it was predictable. Japanese defenders knew Marines were coming, knew they would attack, regardless of defenses, knew they would accept any casualties necessary to achieve objectives, knew they would never stop until the position fell or every Marine was dead. That knowledge did not help Japanese forces defend successfully. It only ensured they understood the futility of their situation while fighting with desperate courage anyway. The psychological burden of fighting an enemy you know will defeat you eventually, that you can only delay through sacrifices that will not change ultimate outcomes, that will kill you because you refuse to surrender even when continuation serves no strategic purpose. That burden destroyed Japanese morale more effectively than American firepower destroyed Japanese positions. The lessons learned from Hill 362 and the broader Iwo Jima campaign influenced American military doctrine for decades. The Marine Corps codified the principles demonstrated in that assault, aggressive forward movement under fire, decentralized decision-making, acceptance of casualties to maintain operational tempo, systematic application of combined arms firepower. These became foundational elements of Marine identity and tactical doctrine. The The psychological cost of implementing such doctrine was acknowledged but considered acceptable because it produced results. Whether individual Marines agreed with this calculation was irrelevant. The culture they joined defined acceptable costs differently than civilian society defined them. Men who could not accept those definitions either never finished training or broke during combat. Those who survived internalized values that seemed irrational to outsiders but proved devastatingly effective in combat. The Japanese military learned complementary lessons that courage and spirit could not overcome material disadvantages, that fighting to the death served honor but not strategy, that modern industrial warfare favored nations with production capacity over nations with warrior traditions. These lessons came too late to change outcomes, but influenced post-war Japanese military thinking fundamentally. 70 years after the battle, veterans from both sides who survived into old age expressed similar sentiments about Hill 362 and the broader campaign. American veterans acknowledged the courage of Japanese defenders while maintaining that taking the hill was necessary and justified. Japanese veterans acknowledged Marine effectiveness while questioning whether continuing resistance after mid-March served any purpose except prolonging suffering. Both sides recognized that modern warfare had created situations where individual courage meant less than industrial capacity, where tactical excellence could not overcome strategic disadvantages, where death became an expected cost that both sides paid until one exhausted the ability to continue. The generation that fought these battles understood something their descendants would debate endlessly, that war at industrial scale transformed courage from a decisive factor into an expected baseline. That victory went not to the bravest soldiers, but to the side that could sustain courage longer while supported by superior resources. Hill 362 proved this truth in 4 hours of combat so intense that participants described it as the worst fighting they experienced. Then, Marines moved to the next objective, and the war continued until one side could no longer sustain the costs of fighting. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.